This is my review of ITV's Eubank Jr. versus George Groves pre-fight documentary. And it's not going to be a very long review because, to be honest with you, I didn't really learn much from the documentary. It didn't really show anything that I didn't already know about the two fighters. Maybe some of you guys out there got more from it than me, but I got the same amount from this documentary as I got from watching interviews with Eubank Jr. and George Groves in the lead up to this fight. And my overall impression, and it is going to sound like I'm just reiterating what I've said in previous videos here, but my overall impression is that both fighters are extremely confident, almost to the point of being contemptuous, at least on the surface. Ostensibly, that's how both guys are coming across, as though they are teetering on the brink of being contemptuous of the other guy in terms of his ability and his chances in the fight. George Groves believes that he's going to knock, this is what he's saying, he's going to knock Chris Eubank Jr. out, and that Eubank Jr. don't have a prayer in the fight. Groves is talking as though this is going to be one of the easiest fights of his career. And that to me is interesting. Sometimes you remember a fighter a bit differently than he actually is when you go back and watch the videos of his fights again. So just today, I went back and watched George Groves' last 4 fights. They were against Jamie Cox, not in this particular order, but they were against Jamie Cox, Martin Murray, Edward Goodnecht, and Fedor Chudinov. I watched all 4 fights, and I have to say that Eubank Jr. has definitely not faced a good long-range boxer since he lost to Billy Joe Saunders. But looking at Groves in his last 4 fights, I struggle to see why Groves is so confident that he's going to have an easy time with Eubank Jr. When Groves says that Eubank Jr. overcommits and he leaves himself open and there's defensive vulnerabilities there, I 100% agree. And when you look at the likes of Goodnecht, Martin Murray, Chudinov, and even Jamie Cox, these are guys who come forward with their hands up. Eubank Jr. typically doesn't have his hands all that high. Sometimes he puts his hands up, but a lot of the time he's fighting with his hands low. And even though he's a much better fighter than those 4 guys I just mentioned, and he absolutely is in my view, that doesn't mean that he has the same strengths and weaknesses as those fighters. That doesn't mean that those fighters don't have certain elements of their game which are stronger than Eubank Jr. And in terms of overcommitting, that is a mistake which Eubank Jr. makes. Overcommitting while not protecting himself, while leaving himself open. That's a mistake that he makes far more than those 4 fighters I mentioned. George Groves, Jamie Cox, Martin Murray, and Edward Goodnecht. Actually, the exception might be Jamie Cox. He does commit quite a lot. And if you watch the George Groves fight, he is kind of lunging in at times, and not as blatantly as Eubank Jr. does, but he does kind of lunge in here and there. But one thing I did take from rewatching those 4 George Groves fights, his last 4 fights, is that those guys were able to take George Groves' power. And this is, I think, a key point in this particular matchup. If Jamie Cox and Goodnecht and Martin Murray and Fedor Chudinov can take Groves' power for a number of rounds, I know Jamie Cox ultimately was taken out in, what was it, the 3rd or 4th round? But he took a lot of solid shots from George Groves before that happened. And so did all the other guys, Martin Murray and all the other guys I mentioned. So if he wasn't able to spark any of those guys out with headshots, and remember he took out Jamie Cox with a body shot, not the headshots. Cox was actually taking the headshots fairly well. If he wasn't able to spark those guys out and get rid of them with headshots early, what chance has he got of taking Eubank Jr. out with headshots early? Is Eubank Jr.'s chin worse than Goodnecht, Martin Murray, Chudinov, and Jamie Cox's chin? That's a question for you guys to ask yourselves and answer in the comment section below. Because Groves really is acting as though this is going to be an easy fight and it's going to be a blowout. He says that when he sparred Eubank Jr. several years ago, that he steadied Eubank Jr.'s legs on several occasions. And he said, that was years ago. And the implication seems to be, George Groves seems to be implying that he's improved since then. Well, I would argue that Eubank Jr. has improved far more since then than George Groves has. And there's an argument to be made that George Groves actually hasn't improved since the time he sparred Eubank Jr. at all, but in fact, he might have regressed in some ways. I think his stamina may have improved, but in terms of his athleticism, his explosiveness, etc., a lot of people are going to argue that they have diminished since the time when he sparred Eubank Jr., which I believe was in the run-up to one of the Froch fights. Correct me if I'm wrong. Or was it in the run-up to the DeGale fight? Either way, you have to imagine, or I certainly believe, that Eubank Jr., if either one of these fighters has improved, it's Eubank Jr. who's improved the most. So George Groves saying, and that was back then, imagine what I do now. Him saying that doesn't seem to make sense to me because Eubank Jr. has improved more than Groves has since then. Do you understand the point I'm making? I know it sounds kind of convoluted, but hopefully you get me. So, yeah, Groves has got an interesting attitude. And I know a lot of people have watched Groves' IFL interview and have watched this ITV documentary, and his absolute unshakable belief has convinced a lot of people that he's going to win. And belief is something that you need in boxing. But George Groves has had this kind of unshakable belief going into fights before. He had it going into the two Carl Froch fights, which he lost, and especially the rematch, he lost that conclusively. He had that going into the Badu Jack fight, he lost that. So it's not like George Groves' unshakable belief has prevented him from losing in the past. It hasn't. So why would it prevent him from losing to Eubank Jr.? And again, when I went and watched those last 4 George Groves fights, those guys were able to close George Groves down and get up close and work on the inside against Groves and have success. With Murray, it was more late in the fight. With Jamie Cox, it was relatively early in the fight. With Chudinov, it was relatively early in the fight. Goodnecht, he didn't really have much success throughout. But the other 3 did. And with 2 of them, it was early. Are they offensively as formidable as Chris Eubank Jr.? I don't think so. So, on the other hand, you've got Chris Eubank Jr., who, again, seems to be equally as contemptuous of George Groves as Groves is of him. He's dismissing George Groves' chance of knocking him out. He says he's got his father's chin. He's not concerned at all about Groves' punching power and all this kind of business. He's never taken a George Groves right hand with 10-ounce gloves on. The time when they sparred, Groves said that Eubank Jr. was wearing a full face head guard, a face saver head guard. So that's basically a head guard where you never actually get caught properly in the face. And you're wearing 16-ounce gloves. So all of this, the contempt that seems to be in the head of both Eubank Jr. and Groves for the other guy, to me is all leading to a dramatic fight. If you've got 2 guys who think the other guy is rubbish, someone's going to get hurt in this fight. And I kind of have started to lean more towards Eubank Jr. after watching or rewatching George Groves' last 4 fights. Because Eubank Jr. is very sloppy, okay, but he's fast. In a similar way to Roy Jones Jr., although Roy Jones is a far superior athlete to Eubank Jr., but in a similar way, Roy Jones Jr. made a lot of technical mistakes when he was in his prime, but because he was such an incredible, actually freak athlete, he was able to get away with technical mistakes. And Eubank Jr. is the same in a lot of his fights. I know the likes of Avni Yildirim are nowhere near as fast or nowhere near as good as George Groves, but he was able to exchange with someone like Yildirim and get away with all that falling in and overcommitting. He was able to get away with it because he was just so much faster than the guy. And actually in the documentary, Eubank Jr. says, that's why I decided to exchange with Yildirim, because I was way faster than him. So will he exchange with George Groves? If Groves shows him early on that he can, if not match him for speed, come close to matching him for speed, will he be so keen on exchanging? Is Eubank Jr. that foolish that he'll just throw caution to the wind regardless of what George Groves is throwing back at him? I don't know. How much does he really believe in his chin? I'm not sure. I think it's a fascinating fight, but I am leaning more towards Eubank Jr. now, just slightly, because of what I saw in, rewatching those 4 George Groves fights. Groves is vulnerable up close. And I don't just mean punch resistance. I mean, his defense is pretty damn sloppy up close. Very sloppy. He doesn't have a particularly tight guard. When he throws punches back, his body is all out of position. He's open to getting hit, and he's not dipping and diving as fast as Eubank Jr. is. Because when Eubank Jr. starts swinging, he will dip down to his left usually, after he swings to get away from your counters. George Groves don't do that. When you've got him up against the ropes and you're exchanging, he'll try and either cover up or he'll swing back, and he leaves himself quite open. A great example is actually the first fight against Carl Froch, the moment where he got stopped. Look at what George Groves was doing. He wasn't dipping and ducking and diving. He had his back to the ropes. He put his hands up and then he tried to fire back without moving his head out of the way. This is how George Groves reacts when someone has got him pinned against the ropes or on the inside. There's very little upper body movement there from George Groves when he's up close. And I think he's going to be very vulnerable in that position against Eubank Jr. But will Eubank Jr. be able to get him into that position? I think he will. If Martin Murray managed to get him into that position, and Chudinov and all these other guys, Jamie Cox, then I think Eubank Jr. is going to be able to get him into that position as well. So I'm leaning now towards Eubank Jr. Because yes, those technical mistakes are there. And I wouldn't be surprised if George Groves cracks him on the chin and Eubank Jr. gets seriously hurt. I wouldn't be surprised. But if we're talking about, taking a gamble here on who you think is going to win, I'm gambling and saying that I think it's more likely that Eubank Jr. manages to avoid the Groves right hand and does manage to get up close. And when he gets up close, he's going to do damage. And damage that George Groves won't be able to resist for a very long time. So let's see if I change my mind in the upcoming weeks. Well, it's only, less than 2 weeks now before the fight, I believe. Is it less than 2 weeks? I think it is, isn't it? It's the weekend after next. So I might change my mind in the next week or so, but I doubt it. At the moment, I'm going to say Eubank Jr. is my pick to win the fight. I don't know how, whether it's going to be points, stoppage, I don't know. But I'm going to take Eubank Jr. Yeah, I think he's the fresher guy. And both guys are defensively vulnerable. But Eubank's athleticism, I think, makes up for his defensive vulnerabilities more than Groves' defensive vulnerabilities. Groves doesn't have the athleticism that Eubank Jr. has. He doesn't have the upper body movement and what have you. And on the inside, again, just go look for yourselves. You go look on Daily Motion if you can't find him on YouTube. Groves' last 4 fights: Jamie Cox, Edward Goodnecht, Fedor Chudinov, and Martin Murray. Go watch those fights and look how vulnerable George Groves is when someone gets him on the ropes. Yeah? And then come back to me after seeing that and tell me that you don't think he's going to be in trouble if Eubank Jr. gets him in the same position. And you might say, well, Eubank won't get him in the same position. Won't he? Why not? What do those other guys have that Eubank Jr. doesn't have in terms of an ability to get Groves into that position? And those guys managed to, hang in there against Groves' headshots for several rounds. Why can't Eubank Jr. hang in there against Groves' headshots for several rounds? Do all those guys have a better chin than Eubank Jr.? I know they keep their hands up more, but they did get clocked. Look at Jamie Cox. He gets clocked with some clean shots from George Groves, and he takes them. Does Eubank Jr. have a worse chin than Jamie Cox? Maybe he does, but we don't, I'm not sure. So far, Eubank Jr. hasn't shown any vulnerability in terms of his punch resistance. So, yeah, anyway, let me know what you felt about the documentary. I said this wasn't going to be a long review, but it turned out to be pretty long in the end. So there you go. But it's not so much the documentary, but it's more the rewatching of George Groves' fights, his last 4 fights, which has made me lean now towards Eubank Jr. winning. And I've seen Eubank Jr.'s most recent fights as well. I'm aware of the mistakes that he makes, but I don't know. I just think Groves' vulnerabilities are going to be more of a factor than Eubank's vulnerabilities. So let me know how you feel in the comment section below. It's Hatman, I'm out.